On behalf of the Dialogue Project at the Foreign Policy Institute for Paul Nitz's School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, I would like to welcome you, our wonderful panel, and Women's Learning Partnership, once again, to what I promise you will be an amazing and wonderful meeting today. We have had the privilege and the pleasure of working with Women's Learning Partnership on, and actually with the other organization that Mahnaz is the president of, the Foundation for Iranian Studies, on a number of issues. And I think that especially in the kind of world that we live today and the kind of problems that we face today, the kind of work that WLP has been doing over the years, silently, without making any claims, and very modestly, is really, really of crucial and central importance. And the event today will prove it one more time. And I just wanted to say a few words about the context of the program today and the importance of organizations that are working around not just issues around women's freedoms and struggle for freedom in specific countries, but the way they are relating these struggles to the larger issues concerning democracy and freedom, and again, not in what we call the Muslim world, but the world over. And I thought that if I wanted to say anything about this event, for an audience like this, if I remind you of just one story, I think you will get the gist of what the context of this program today is all about. And that is a story that you all are absolutely familiar with. If you just go back a few thousand years ago and go back to the story of Shahrazad and 1001 Nights, and you remember that against one of the most absolutist systems, when you have a king whose queen betrays him, and he, without having any dialogue, without having watched Law and Order, would kill her, would not hear what she has to say about the reason she betrays him, and in order to prevent her from prevent other women from betraying him, he marries a virgin every night and then kills them in the morning before they have the chance to betray him. And against such absolute power, such absolute public power, what do we have to do? We have the power of one woman, Shahrazad, who does two things. She refuses to speak the language that the oppressor speaks. I think that is one lesson that you will learn from the event today, that in order to create fundamental change, you have to refuse to enter the domain and speak the same language and fight with the same weapons that your oppressor does, namely violence. And she refuses to become like the queen, that would lie and betray and still remain within that domain and die. Or the virgins, and we all wonder, why don't they take a knife to the bed, one of them at least, and do away with him. But anyway, had any of them taken a knife to the bed and done away with the king, they would not have changed the mindset. And that again is one other thing that this meeting does today. It is not about changing just politics, but it is changing the mindsets. So Shahrazad takes the king out of his public domain of absolutist power and takes her to the private domain and to the domain of imagination, and creates and awakens his sense of curiosity, where he wants to listen to her stories every day, and teaches him that the world is not black and white, that not all women are betrayers, that there are good women and bad women, good kings and bad kings. The world is filled with color, filled with variety. And that is how she cures the king and changes the system. So the event today, and the women whom you're going to be meeting today, are part of this time-honored tradition. And very, very briefly, what is the importance of a meeting like this today is, first, it tells you how central, how vital the issue of women's rights and women's struggles is to the issue of freedom and democracy in the countries we call Muslim. And I very much object to calling it the Muslim world when we're talking about countries with such amazingly different traditions and diversities, reducing it to one aspect of it, which is Islam, and reducing a great religion with a great tradition of philosophy, of debate, of openness behind it into one aspect of it, which is fundamentalism. This is again what these women today are all about, to show you the variety of opinions that comes out of the Muslim world, the variety of images that come out of the Muslim world, which has been confiscated both by the extremists in that world and by the elite in this country and in the West as we speak. To make it very short then, the struggle of women, they are the canaries in the mine. If you want to know how democratic, how open a society is, go to its women. The second thing is you hear about all these horrible laws, and you hear about confiscation of a great religion as an ideology by the powers that are right now. And some people in the West feel a great deal of condescension and say, oh, these poor women, these victims. They are victims, but they're not these poor women. And in fact, because of the fact that they are victims, they are the hope in each of this country. And what we want to talk about in this meeting today is the way these women have found ways, like their predecessor, to not fight with the same weapons that they do, not through violence, but through slow, painful change, step by step, bringing consciousness, awakening people's senses and awakening people to their own power. To be a woman in the Muslim world today is one of the best gifts you can have, because you're at the center of change, and I think that is the aspect of it that we should be proud of. And the last thing that I want to say is how important, and the book that you will be saying, the book over there that has been translated from Maghreb around the issues of how WFP has published it, and it is about how women have been changing their lives. That book and that translation and the work that has been done here through this organization and through events like this will bring to our attention not just how important these women and their struggles are in the countries where they work, and how important it is that we hear about one another. Just today I had from the internet the struggle of Iranian women right now today, when they're talking about how many steps to freedom, and when they're protesting and saying that women are half of the country, their freedom means the freedom of Iran. Now, this is the important thing for this networking, for us to remember and to learn through dialogue from one another. And the last thing, in this country, in the West today, and if Mrs. Hughes, perhaps, before she went to the other countries as the ambassador of one of the greatest countries in the world, if she went to those countries knowing something about the struggle of these women, and would not think that she would bring liberty to them, had she not done that, what she would have learned was how much she would have to learn from the struggle of these women in these other countries. I want to remind you of mid-1800s, of women like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I want you to remind you of a time that is not still 100 years ago, when women in this country and in Europe could not speak publicly, that Mrs. Stowe, when she went to England, her husband had to speak her speech. She was an international bestseller, by the way. And when women could not be sitting in the galleries in the parliament, ladies had to be seen in galleries where they were to see but not be seen. And that in this country, women started to vote in 1924. And we want to remind you that 500,000 British women stood behind the anti-slavery movement in America and said that slavery should stop. And women's struggles and the anti-slavery movements were linked together. Shame on those today who are not supporting the struggle of women in the different countries under the guise of it's their culture. Shame on those women today who think that they cannot learn from what is happening in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Iran, in Morocco, and in Tunisia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our wonderful panel today, and I would like to look forward to the exchange after their panel. I also have one bad news for you, and that is serious. One of our panelists, one of the most wonderful women that through Mahnaz and WFP have had the honor of knowing and coming to respect a great deal, Asma Qadar, from Jordan would not be able to come to the meeting today because, as you know, about the tragic events that happened in Jordan, and Asma right now is needed over there in order to work in the anti-terror campaign and activities that are going on there. So she's needed over there, and we're all with her and with the Jordanian people at this very tragic time. We thought that Mahnaz would be the best representative, actually, of both Asma and herself, and we sort of forced her to become a member of the panel, so she will be talking on her behalf. And you'll have the misfortune of having me sit up there again. I was going to be sitting down there and enjoying myself as the chair, but I would not be talking, fortunately. Okay, so without further ado, let me give you a very brief introduction to our speakers and give the microphone to them. I begin with my friend, my great friend, Mahnaz Afkhami, whom I have known her through thick and thin, and I don't need to get sentimental about it over here. She is author of many books. She has edited and written books and given interviews both on the importance of issues of women, not just in her own country, Iran, but around the world. And she has been working on this issue for more than 3 decades. She's the founder and president of Women's Learning Partnership, executive director of the Foundation for Iranian Studies, and by the way, she was one of the 2 women ministers in Iran in late 1970s, the youngest minister, I think she was, and she was Minister for Women's Affairs, something that we still don't have, of course, in the United States. Then I would also like to introduce to you Zaina Anwar from Malaysia. My God, you know, when I remember seeing her first in Germany, I think it was, and to see the struggle that Malaysian women and people like Zainab had been fighting, you know, to create the legislature in favor of women, that was the first time I realized how different we all are and how much we have to learn from one another. She's a women's rights activist, and she's a very well-published freelance writer. She's the executive director of Sisters in Islam, and she was formerly a member of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, chief program officer for the political division of the Commonwealth at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, and senior analyst at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. And last, but as they say, and they say the truth, not least, is Rabia Nasiri from Morocco. And we will be talking a great deal about the kind of works that she and her fellow sisters have been doing in Morocco. In many ways, Morocco has become for us an example and a test and a model about how you can create change through reform. She is a board member and former president of Collective 95, Maghreb Egalité, a network of women's associations and women researchers from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, committed to prevented violence against women. She has written extensively on Arab women and poverty, women and Islam, and capacity building for women. So please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel, and I hope you enjoy it.
Logistics. I want to thank my great friend Azar. He makes us all proud to have her actually being so widely read throughout the world. You know, I see her book in the airports from Bangkok to Amsterdam in 20-some languages. I don't even keep up with it. And I'm really proud, and I think it's relevant to today's conversation, is that among other values that her work has brought, is that she is a woman from the Middle East, from Iran, commenting on great works of British and American literature, and commenting wisely and well. And that's something that is new. We're usually relegated to our own area, talking about our own issues, and I think that it's very right that she does that out of knowledge and out of understanding and out of courage, actually. So it's among the things that she has done that we're all very proud of. And as she said, we're going to have, in fact, this is my part of this presentation, because I had hoped I'd be sitting and introducing the brilliant panel. I'm going to just take a short few minutes to say what I think Asma would have said, and if had she been with us. I think Rabia will be telling us later, from what she has briefed us about the process of change that the guide represents. And Zainab will follow through with the application of that process to Malaysia and Malaysia's experience. So I'm going to sort of briefly tell you what this whole thing is about, so far as each one of us are concerned, in terms of women living in that part of the world or connected to that part of the world, or as it is, everyone's connected to everyone everywhere, for good or bad. But points that are important for us to have in mind is why family laws. In the West, it's sort of difficult to see the importance of family laws, because somehow it doesn't come across that family laws in Muslim-majority countries relate to every aspect of life that women are connected to. From the age of marriage, which in some countries like Iran goes down, right now it's sort of ambiguous, anywhere from 9 to 13. A 9-year-old can stand as an adult when she's being tried for crimes, and she can be legally married. So from that to permission to leave the country, freedom of travel, freedom of expression, freedom to hold a job, to make decisions about your family, place of residence, to a wide range of issues. Actually, 11 of them, the themes, are being discussed in this book. And inheritance, for instance, is also another aspect of it. So it's sort of an envelope within which all of the issues related to the status of women are dictated or at least negotiated. So this is why family laws are so important. And it's also very important to realize that family laws are the one area where all of these Muslim majority governments feel that it has to be truly Islamic, quote unquote. And they interpret Islamic in different ways, whatever happens to come to mind at the moment. But they do, for instance, easily take Swiss civic law or French criminal law or all kinds of legislation relating to commerce and whatever from the West, and there doesn't seem to be any problem with it. But when it comes to family law, the test of validity of the cultural authenticity of these governments happens to be in how they treat women within family laws. This is something that one has to realize, that Sharia law, the way it's being interpreted, simply negotiates these laws in most of these countries. It's really basically boiling down to patriarchy and boiling down to the same type of thing that is applicable to other parts of the world. It's the same type of thing, for instance, why in this great country, after tens of decades of struggle and resources and education, we still have something like 14% of women in decision making. So it's not that different. Patriarchy finds its ways and finds its arguments, So that's something to have in mind, why people have spent so much time, when we listen to Rabia later to describe the process, why so many people have spent so much time focusing on that, and why it's so difficult and dangerous to approach family laws, and why most international human rights organizations, when they come to family laws, are frightened into inaction, because somehow they think that has to do with culture and religion and authenticity, and there's something sacred about it. It really isn't. It's just another way of expressing lack of equality and lack of freedom. Now, again, as I promised, I'm not going to take too much time. I only want to say one other thing about the whole context of this, and that is that the civic society women's organizations in Muslim-majority countries have had a sort of a position of opposition, struggle from outside, trying to mobilize, trying to pressure, and so forth. This guide represents both that, of course, that kind of advocacy, but it also represents an attempt to dialogue, an attempt to influence decision makers through negotiation, because it represents a huge amount of knowledge and expertise brought to bear in a number of fields. The book represents the arguments from sociological and the health sciences, when you talk about child marriage, let's say, or other areas of the sort. It brings arguments from constitutions of the countries, the existing foundational laws. It brings arguments from legislation that is in contradiction with the very constitution that is supposed to be the base for it. It brings arguments also from the Quran and from the Hadith, which is the practice and words of the Prophet as remembered later by those close to him. So there is a combination of scientific, legal, local and international, as well as cultural bases that not only women activists can use in order to pressure, to advocate, to struggle, but also to give the legislatures, many of whom, even though they're men, some of them, most of them, even they really want sometimes, often, to change. And they need this material, this information, in order to use it for change. So this provides that kind of thing. And the final thing, the motive for us, the facilitator in our partnership, Women's Learning Partnership, to translate this is to make it accessible, let's say, to Zaina in Malaysia, and when the Persian comes out for Iran and Afghanistan, so that this conversation can extend to others, and so that this solidarity can be nurtured across religion and across not religion, but across ethnic, geographic, national, and other lines. One small example, just to see how this works. One of the items in the book, for instance, is the abolition of the duty to obey. Now, this is something that is in the laws of the three countries specifically whose organizations helped to produce this book. The Article 36 of the Algerian Family Code, for instance, says, a wife must obey her husband and respect him as the head of the household, nurse the couple's offspring if she is able to do so, and raise the children, respect her husband's parents and relatives. Now, this is also in the Moroccan law, something similar to it, and in Tunisia. So there are quotes from all of the actual family laws. But then, on the other hand, there are quotes from the constitution of these countries, most of them modeled after more enlightened constitutions, where the Moroccan constitution, for instance, says all Moroccans are equal before the law. And in Tunisia, all citizens shall have the same rights and the same duties. They shall be equal before the law. So this contradiction comes out. And then, of course, the sociological, what kind of a problems comes out in a changed society where women are no longer sitting at home, even though they always worked, even when they start at home, but they're actually going out and supporting a family. So obeying a husband, whether you can have a job or not, for instance, impacts greatly on the economics. And of course, there are items from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. All are equal before the law, and all are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection, the Declaration of Human Rights, which these countries have signed. So, and then there's from all the other conventions as well. I don't want to take too much, but what I'm saying is that in some detail, using the best scholarship that is available, and I didn't read the Hadith and the Quran, of course, maybe I should, because that's sort of, well, for instance, they always quote this bit from the Quran that says men have authority over women because Allah has made the one superior to the other and because they spend their wealth to maintain them. So this is the one that comes out all the time to beat Islam. But of course there are, you know, a number of others that say different things. Like the text says, He gave you wives, God gave you wives from among yourself, that you might live in tranquility with them, and planted love and kindness in your hearts. So that's there to see. And the hadiths too, the stories that come from the Prophet's actions, there's plenty in them that talk about women, I mean, almost throughout the Quran, believing men and believing women are mentioned in almost exactly next to each other. So I just wanted to point out as an example of the type of argument that has been put together here, and the transformative nature of that, both in terms of working together inside, outside, pressuring from the outside, but working to negotiate with insiders to change policy, and the actual tremendous positive effects that this has had in Morocco and the Maghreb countries, and how this is spreading across to other Muslim countries, coming from a movement that is being nurtured, taking root and growing, both from the grassroots up and from the grass tops. So it's something that we all look to with great positive thinking and hope that it will transform not only the women's lives in the Middle East, but the lives of everyone. Thank you.
As you've probably noticed, I will be speaking in French, and Shari will be helping me with the interpretation. I'd like to first of all thank Mahnaz and the Women's Learning Partnership for having taken the efforts to translate this book. It's a very important step for us, and it's going to be very important for us to have the English version.
Donc je vais faire une présentation très courte, disons, pas de l'histoire, du processus de ce document, mais aussi du processus du changement au Maghreb, parce que ce document a accompagné le changement dans le statut des femmes dans les trois pays, Algérie, Maroc et Tunisie.
So I'm going to rapidly present the book to you and explain how it was used in not only the historical process behind the guide, but how it was used to promote reform and change in the three Maghreb countries, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia.
Alors, juste un rappel très bref. Après les indépendances des trois pays, Maroc, Algérie et Tunisie, le Maroc et l'Algérie ont opté pour une législation familiale qui était réactionnaire.
Just to give you a quick reminder or background, after the three countries gained their independence, Algeria and Morocco opted for the route of family legislation that was a reactionary.
Elle était basée pour l'essentiel sur le droit très très fidèle au droit musulman et surtout au rite malikite.
And it was very much based on Muslim law and in particular on the Malikite rite.
Donc, Mahnaz en a parlé, obéissance de l'épouse à l'époux, tutelle matrimoniale, répudiation, polygamie, inégalité en matière de tutelle égale et inégalité dans l'héritage.
And as Mahnaz alluded to, this was based on the wife's duty to obey her husband, matrimonial guardianship, repudiation, which is the husband's unilateral right to end the marriage, polygamy, inequality in terms of guardianship and inheritance.
Par contre, la Tunisie était différente puisqu'il y avait à la tête de la Tunisie un grand réformateur politique qui était le président Bouguiba, qui a opté pour une législation beaucoup plus avancée.
Tunisia, on the other hand, had a great reformer at its head at the time, President Bourguiba, who opted for family legislation that was much more liberal.
Et donc, mais qui s'inscrit toujours dans l'islam, c'est ça qui est intéressant. Elle s'inscrit dans l'islam, mais beaucoup plus libérale, et surtout plus libérale.
Legislation that is more liberal, but is still rooted in Islam. That's the interesting parallel.
Donc, en Tunisie, depuis l'indépendance, la Tunisie, il n'y a pas de polygamie, il n'y a pas d'obéissance, etc.
So, since its independence, Tunisia no longer has the duty to obey, no longer has polygamy, and so forth.
Par contre, il y a inégalité devant l'héritage.
However, there still is inequalities in terms of inheritance rights.
Alors là, j'ai essayé de retracer un peu les grandes étapes de mobilisation, pas au niveau de chaque pays, mais au niveau des 3 pays ensemble.
And this gives you a time frame of the major steps that we went through in terms of mobilizing our efforts, not at the individual country level, but at the level of the 3 countries together.
Et je suis contente de voir dans la salle une amie qui a contribué à ce processus. J'ai été très heureuse de la voir ici maintenant à Washington, à Azar.
And I'm very happy to see a friend of mine who contributed to this process and who now lives in Washington.
Alors, en 1992, nous avons créé un réseau composé de plusieurs associations de droits des femmes du Maroc, d'Algérie et Tunisie.
So in 1992, we created a network of several different women's organizations from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria.
Et ce réseau comprenait aussi des femmes chercheurs et universitaires.
And this network also included women who were researchers and academics.
Il s'appelle le collectif 95 Maghreb Égalité.
And it was called Collective 95 Maghreb Equality.
Après, donc, en 1995, nous avons publié un document sur lequel je vais revenir, qui a été très très important et qui a marqué une rupture dans l'histoire des 3 pays, qui s'appelle « 100 mesures et dispositions pour une utilisation égalitaire ».
And then in 1995, we published a book that was very important, and I will come back to this in a moment, but this was a very definitive marking point in the history of the 3 countries, and it was called 100 Measures and Provisions for an Egalitarian Codification of the Personal Status Codes and Family Law in the Maghreb.
C'était pour nous un code parallèle, alternatif. C'est un code alternatif à la législation officielle dans les 3 pays.
This was for us an alternative code to the official legislation in the 3 countries.
Et en 2000, nous avons commencé à travailler sur le manuel de l'égalité.
In 2000, then we began working on the guide that we were discussing.
Et ça nous a pris 4 ans pour le terminer.
It took us 4 years to complete the guide.
Donc, ce que je voulais dire, ce qui est très important dans ce processus, c'est qu'on se réunissait pour travailler. Il y avait la réflexion, mais il y avait aussi l'action sur le terrain, puisque le collectif était composé de chercheurs, mais aussi d'activistes sur le terrain. Et c'était ça qui était intéressant.
And I just simply wanted to note that there was a combination of both thought process and also action in the field, because the network, as I said, included researchers and activists in the field.
Alors, ce livre et son mesure de disposition a joué un rôle très important dans l'histoire des réformes, l'histoire récente des réformes au Maghreb, parce qu'il a brisé des tabous. Il a brisé un certain nombre de tabous. C'était pas difficile de le faire pour chaque pays, mais ensemble, c'était plus facile.
This book, 100 Measures and Provisions, was very important in the recent history of reforms in the 3 countries of the Maghreb. It allowed us to break down many of the taboos, and we would not have been able to do it on an individual country level basis, but working together, the 3 countries were able to do it.
Il y avait 100 mesures, dans 100 articles, pour dire voilà comment doit être la législation familiale dans les 3 pays du Maghreb.
In this book, there are 100 articles that state what family legislation should be in the Maghreb countries.
Il a été traduit en plusieurs langues et réédité plusieurs fois.
It's been translated into several languages, and the Arabic version has been republished several times.
Alors, ce document a été l'objet de beaucoup de discussions, de disputes, de conflits entre les membres du collectif, entre surtout 2 positions. Il est le compromis entre deux positions, une position radicale et une position pragmatique.
This book was the subject of many discussions, debates, even conflicts among members of the network, and it represents a compromise between 2 positions, a radical position and a more pragmatic position.
Alors la position radicale était la position tunisienne, parce que les Tunisiennes étaient plus avancées. Elles voulaient aller encore plus loin, donc elles optaient pour la laïcité.
So the radical position was that which was advanced by the Tunisians, because they were more advanced in the process and they wanted to go even further and advocate for secularism.
Pour les Marocaines, c'était le pragmatisme qui prévalait, parce que ce qui était important pour les Marocaines, c'est de changer la Moudouana, parce que les conservateurs nous disaient la Moudouana est un texte sacré et ne peut pas être changé. On voulait absolument le changer.
And from the Moroccan point of view, we were more pragmatic because what was important to us was to change the Moudouana, the family law, because conservatives would say that the Moudouana law was sacred and could not be changed, and so it was very important for us to be able to change the Moudouana.
Alors le résultat de ce processus et de ces conflits et débats, c'est que ce document, les 100 mesures, parle de l'égalité dans l'héritage, ce qui est quelque chose d'absolument révolutionnaire dans le monde musulman. On n'ose pas parler d'égalité dans l'héritage.
So the results of this process, these discussions, these debates, is that the 100 Measures talks first of all about equality in terms of inheritance rights, which is absolutely revolutionary in the Muslim world. It's just unheard of to talk about equality and inheritance.
Il parle du mariage de la musulmane avec le non-musulman, ce qui n'est pas acceptable.
It also talks about the right of a Muslim woman to marry a non-Muslim man, which is also not acceptable,
Etc.
and so forth.
Et deuxième résultat, c'est que nous avons utilisé le double référentiel. Le référentiel universel, le droit de l'homme, et le référentiel religieux. C'est ça qui a donné une particularité à notre démarche.
And the other thing that was unique in our approach is that we had a double reference point. We had the religious reference point and then the universal reference point, which was universal human rights.
Donc, quelques années, peut-être 5 ans après la publication de 100 mesures de disposition, nous avons commencé à réfléchir sur la production d'un manuel, un guide, pour expliquer et argumenter plus, donner des arguments aux activistes, aux gens qui travaillent sur le terrain.
So approximately 5 years after the publication of 100 Measures, we began thinking about preparing a guide that could be used to give further explanation, to give more arguments for activists and advocates working in the field.
Alors cet argumentaire, donc ce guide a été publié en arabe et en français en même temps, et aujourd'hui, grâce à Mahnaz et à WFP en anglais.
The guide was published simultaneously in Arabic and in French, and then now, currently, thanks to the efforts of Mahnaz and WLP, it's also been published in English.
Alors, comme l'a dit Mahnaz, donc il y a des arguments sociologiques, juridiques, de droits humains et du droit musulman.
So as Mahnaz said, there are arguments that are based on sociology, there are legal arguments, human rights arguments, and arguments based on Muslim law.
Et ce qui est très intéressant à dire, c'est qu'il a suscité un débat contradictoire entre les ulama, les savants théologiens, les savants religieux au Maroc, en Algérie, et je trouve ça très intéressant parce que certains ont dit c'est un sacrilège, d'autres ont dit non. Et le monde du mouvement des femmes sont raisonnables, sont rationnels, etc. Et ça, c'était très intéressant.
What is interesting is that this did lead to a debate among the ulema, the traditional religious theologians in Morocco and in Algeria, some taking the position that Muslim law was sacred, and others saying that no, the claims and the claims of the women's movement are actually reasonable and rational.
Et donc ce débat a montré que l'islam n'est pas unique, qu'il n'y a pas une seule lecture de l'islam, puisque eux-mêmes n'étaient pas d'accord entre eux.
So this goes to show that there's not one single interpretation of Islam, because even amongst these theologians there was not agreement.
Alors, ce document il est vu comme un document de ressources, mais aussi un document surtout pour le plaidoyer.
So this guide is seen not only as a resource, but also a tool for advocacy.
Alors, quels sont les principaux messages? Je vais passer rapidement, presque perfect. Les principaux messages donc, dans ce document. 1. L'islam garantit la dignité des hommes et des femmes et ne peut pas être invoqué pour discriminer les femmes.
To quickly give you an idea of the main messages in this book, first of all, Islam guarantees the dignity of women and cannot be invoked as a reason to discriminate against women or to violate their rights.
Deuxième message, le droit musulman, il y a une différence entre l'islam et le droit musulman. Le droit musulman, qui est une interprétation historique du Coran et de la Sunna, a toujours fait l'objet de débats et de divergences entre plusieurs rites, plusieurs écoles.
The second main message is that in Muslim law, which is the human and historical interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, there's always been debate among religious leaders of the different rites and schools of thought, and that Muslim law is not the same thing as Islam.
Troisième message, le droit musulman ne constitue plus un cadre suffisant aujourd'hui pour la société du Maghreb pour régler tous les problèmes complexe de la société.
And the third message is that Muslim law is no longer an appropriate or an adequate framework for Muslim countries to resolve the conflicts, the very complex problems of society today.
Le quatrième message, le vécu des femmes, le vécu social, économique, etc. des femmes, le vécu des familles requiert des solutions et des réponses concrètes, et pas seulement des principes.
And the next message is that the social and economic experiences of some of the most underprivileged women requires concrete, definitive solutions.
Et enfin, les États du Maghreb sont partis à plusieurs conventions internationales et ils ont des responsabilités à partir du moment où ils ont ratifié ces conventions.
And finally, the fact that the Maghreb states are parties to several international conventions and therefore have to assume their responsibilities having ratified these conventions.
Alors, je voulais vous dire que ce que vous trouvez ici, pour l'Algérie et pour le Maroc, je suis heureuse de vous apprendre que ça a changé, grâce au travail qui a été fait par des associations, le mouvement des femmes au Maroc, en Algérie. Il y a eu des changements de ces lois au Maroc en 2004 et en Algérie en 2005. Donc nous avons gagné en fait.
And I'm actually pleased to report to you today that some of what you find in this book is no longer valid because there have been changes in the laws thanks to the efforts of the women's associations. The laws were changed in Morocco in 2004 and in Algeria in 2005. So we've won in a certain sense.
Et ce livre a été très utilisé pour le plaidoyer, avec un message par exemple de la campagne marocaine de plaidoyer, la réforme est nécessaire et elle est possible.
And this guide was used as an advocacy tool, especially in our campaign to reform the law, and it helped us to convey the message that reform is necessary and possible.
Et par exemple, la version arabe de ce guide a été distribuée à tous les parlementaires marocains, à Sa Majesté le roi du Maroc, à son cabinet, à tout l'entourage du roi. Tout le monde a eu un exemplaire et nous avons retrouvé certaines phrases dans le texte de la proposition de loi pour changer la loi.
And to give you an example, the Arabic version of this guide was distributed to all members of parliament, the king, his cabinet, his entire entourage. Everyone had a copy, and in the legislation, the proposed legislation to change the law, we actually see phrases taken from the book.
Alors, je termine par une photo de mobilisation des femmes en Maroc pour le changement de la loi. Voilà. En 2002. Donc ça, c'était une grande manifestation des femmes pour demander le changement de la loi. Et merci.
I'd like to simply end by showing you a picture of women coming out to demonstrate in favor of changing the Mudwana. This was in 2000. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, I must thank Mahnaz for giving me this opportunity to be up here, and also for giving us an advanced copy of this guide, because that has enabled us to work on our model draft law based on the principles of equality and justice and non-discrimination, and using this guide as a framework. Like the Maghrebi women's movement, what we're doing in Malaysia, Sisters in Islam is doing, is coming out with a model draft and providing, again, the similar 4 levels of arguments, the doctrinal level Islamic arguments for reform, constitutional national laws level of arguments, international human rights instruments level of government arguments, and also the national law and constitutional level. So we think that this is a very comprehensive and holistic approach, and of course we think compelling, approach to law reform. I mean, as many of us know, law reform can be very frustrating and takes a long time to see fruition. And in our experience, it's really much easier to stop a law from being adopted than to make changes to laws once they are in place. And within the context of Muslim family laws, the effort at reform poses particular challenges because the push for a more egalitarian legal regime that recognizes equality between men and women in Islam is often regarded as un-Islamic, and an attempt to impose alien Western values on the Muslims. And so many women's groups in Muslim countries have actually begun to engage with the religious text and to realize the importance of locating our effort at change, at reform, from within the framework of Islam. That it is not just enough to use human rights principles and constitutional principles, but you need to locate that within the tradition as well. And Sisters in Islam has been submitting memorandums for reform of the family law to the government since 1996. And even though we've had all kinds of negotiations with the Ministry for Women and Family Development, with the Attorney General's chambers, with officials from the religious department, a lot of it, is basically just remains on the shelf. Yeah, there's just so much resistance to that reform process, and just recently, the family law again was amended in Malaysia. Although they adopted some of the suggestions that we made, including including the division of matrimonial property at the time of polygamy, but other aspects of the law reform were actually discriminatory against women. And basically, last year, we just reached a stage where we said, enough is enough. We're just not going to deal with this family law anymore because the framework is discriminatory. And also looking at the trend in the Muslim world now, where countries like Morocco, like Tunisia, like Turkey, like Indonesia, are basically moving towards reform based on a framework of equality. So basically, the traditional Islamic family law does not regard man and woman, husband and wife, as equal partners in the marriage. And as Mahnaz went through some of the examples of the inequalities in the family law. So the trend now in many Muslim countries is to push for reform based, so a framework rather than a patchwork approach to reform, which has been the trend over the 100 years, basically on issues like polygamy, on issues of divorce, on the marriage contract, where Muslim countries in codifying Islamic family law kind of like took a patchwork approach to lessen the discrimination against women. That basically this is an approach that remains within a very flawed framework, given the context of the realities of women's lives in the 21st century. New research, besides the trend in Muslim countries, new research as well on classical juristic texts, which critically analyzes the construction of gender in Islamic legal theory, has also provided us, with further impetus for reform. And the point that we raise publicly is, if justice is the indisputable objective of Sharia, of Islamic law, shouldn't this principle then be reflected in laws that regulate the relationship between and the rights of a husband and wife? And basically, we've had enough, pussyfooting with a very flawed framework that discriminates against women, and that the belief that Islam is just and Sharia is just must be put to test. And here I just want to mention to you the work of two academics, Ziba Mir Hosseini, who's Iranian, based in London, and Kesha Ali, who's based, I think right now, at the Harvard Divinity School. Both of them have done research on the construction of gender in Islamic legal theory, in the classical Islamic legal theory. And a critique of the classical juristic framework of marriage in Islam, which basically clearly points out that it can have no relevance today in the 21st century to govern the relationship between a husband and a wife. That classical framework, which today still influences the construction of Islamic family law in Muslim countries, was influenced by the logic of a contract of sale. In exchange for a payment of a dowry, a woman comes under her husband's authority. And at the core of this marriage contract, as the classical jurists formulated it, is the wife's submission, defined as unhampered sexual availability, which is regarded as a man's right, the right of a man and the duty of a woman to submit, in exchange for maintenance, defined as shelter, food, and clothing, which is a woman's right and the duty of a man to provide. Thus, marriage in that juristic framework was conceived in terms of commerce and ownership, with jurists even making frequent analogies between marriage and the institution of slavery, husbands and masters, wives and slaves, because that was the context of the relationship of men and women during that time. And in exchange for the dowry, the husband gained a type of ownership in the form of sexual access over the wife. The wife had to be sexually available to him at all times, such that he had total control even over her movement to and from the house. In return, he was required to provide maintenance and support, to the extent that key classical jurists even stated that the wife had no duty to cook or perform the housework herself or for her husband, or even to nurse the baby. You can send the baby out to a wet nurse. So this was the construction of the classical period that still informs the ideology in the 21st century. And we're saying that given the realities and complexities of men and women's lives today, such a conception of marriage is of course no longer sustainable. You know, but, and of course, as I had mentioned earlier, some of the common approaches taken to law reform have focused on adding conditions to the marriage contract, such as you know, the right for a woman to a divorce if the husband prevents her from working, if the husband prevents her from furthering her education. And in some countries, if a husband takes another wife, that is also a condition in the marriage contract, she can get a divorce. And substantive provisions in the family law, such as making polygamy more difficult, making divorce more difficult to minimize the discrimination. You know, but this patchwork approach, this band-aid approach to redress a flawed contract, you know, based on this assumption of inequality, really has little bearing to today's realities. And as more women are educated, you know, in the Muslim world, you know, more women are educated, women are outperforming men academically, as more women work and become financially independent and contribute to the family expenses, the dynamics of marital relations in the modern world have changed. The traditional relationship of the providing male and subservient female homemaker is no longer the model Muslim marriage, nor is it realistic. Given these changing realities, the legal logic that produced the law which governs the personal status of Muslims to this day will have to change then. And this is not to say that the traditional Islamic family law and its assumptions are wrong. The classical jurists were guided by the circumstances of their times. Given a different time and a different form of marriage and a different reality in the lives of men and women today, the legal framework governing marital relations must necessarily change. In a modern world dominated by an ethical paradigm of justice, equality, freedom, and dignity, the Quran provides a wealth of guiding principles to develop a new jurisprudence on marriage based on the principles of equality and justice. A new Muslim family law grounded on several Quranic verses, as Rabia had mentioned, verses of equality before the eyes of God, relationship of mutual protection between men and women, of men and women being each other's garment, can provide the Islamic framework for this reform effort. The guide, the Maghrebi Guide to Equality, produced by the Collective 95, has really been instrumental in helping us to shape you know, our own document for a model family law. And we're now actually working you know, on the second draft. You know, if Mahnaz had not given us an earlier copy, we would only now start the work. But we are already working into the second draft of our guide. And we've begun a series of consultations with women's groups in terms of developing the arguments, especially at the national laws, constitutional framework level, and human rights level. And some of the key reforms, similar to how the Maghrebi countries as well have demanded, for example, equal minimum age of marriage, because right now, basically in most Muslim family laws, different age of marriage for men and women. So we are asking for, equal minimum age of marriage. Again, like the Maghrebi, no consent for marriage for a woman. The traditional view is that a man can marry whomever he wants, but a woman needs the consent of her guardian before she can marry. So we are asking that this be abolished. Polygamy is forbidden under the standard form of marriage contract. So all marriages under the standard marriage contract would be monogamous, and polygamy is allowed only in very exceptional circumstances and governed by a separate marriage contract agreement. Equal right to divorce, and divorce only by judicial decree, which means no exception, no divorce outside of the court. Matrimonial assets to be divided equally, instead of the present standard practice of awarding only 1/3 to the wife. It's a joint matrimonial asset. Equal right to guardianship. This is of course an important issue for us because women traditionally, under Islamic family law, women do enjoy custody of their children, but they do not get guardianship of their children. So that means they cannot make decisions on issues such as the schooling of the children, application for passports for the children, surgery for children, basically any official document that requires signature of the guardian, which for Muslims in Malaysia, it means the signature of the father. So we want equal right to guardianship of children, which the non-Muslims do enjoy in Malaysia. And actually, I'm talking about a work in progress. So we are in the midst right now of drawing up our campaign and public education strategies for this model law to be adopted. And we're again looking at the experience because I think the Moroccan women really worked out an excellent public education campaign, taking advertisements in the print media. I'm not quite sure about radio and television, but certainly some of the print ads are very, very effective in bringing up real life stories of discrimination vis-a-vis the ideal, what the universal human rights says or what the law says, but women are not able to access those rights under the law. And as a strategy too, given the resistance that we know we're going to face from traditional religious scholars, from Islamist activists in Malaysia, we also, we thought a better strategy would really to introduce this reform effort by having an international consultation next year, where we'll bring in people like Rabia from Morocco, from Turkey, from Indonesia, countries, Muslim countries that have begun this reform or introduced this reform from an equality framework to speak of their experience to our religious scholars and decision makers in Malaysia so that they know that this is an international trend. This is not some radical revolutionary idea, that we in Malaysia have conjured, out of, the hat. And so I think it's important to expose the decision makers and the policy makers to what is going on in other parts of the Muslim world. And also we've also begun discussing with our friends in Indonesia who also have to do a regional initiative, to consider doing this as a regional initiative again so that we're not isolated, that this is just one country doing it, but to really start this regional movement and do a regional initiative. Indonesia actually, the Ministry of Religion in Indonesia actually supported a draft law based on the principles of equality, and it was submitted to Parliament and it was rejected by Parliament, and just all hellfire and damnation. And so the minister then withdrew the bill and has actually distanced himself from the bill. But the gender advisor to the Minister of Education, who was responsible in taking the lead on this, is still trying to negotiate with the women's groups and trying to build a campaign on how to introduce this again into the Indonesian parliament, and we hope that we would be able to work together. And again, looking at the Moroccan example, because right now in Malaysia, the authority that drafts this law is basically a very small group of largely men who draft Islamic laws and then sent it, to the Attorney General's chambers for the language, and then it gets sent to Parliament and to the state legislative assemblies. Again, we feel this is a very undemocratic way of drafting laws, and that we would then want to urge for the formation either of a national commission or a parliamentary select committee in the way that the parliamentary select committee was formed in Malaysia in the 1970s and 80s to reform the family law that governed the personal status of non-Muslims, where the select committee then goes all over the country to hear submissions from different groups on the need for the reform of the law. So we haven't decided whether to ask for a national commission or to use the parliamentary select committee mechanism to get the hearings done. And fifth and most importantly, we need to plan a major public education campaign to build support across the broad constituency of women and human rights groups at the national level, and plan a series of activities and events to generate public attention, public support, and press interest. And we're looking again closely, at various models of campaigning, for religious law, for change in religious laws or customary laws. The Campaign for a Domestic Violence Act in Malaysia, which makes domestic violence a crime, whether committed by Muslims or non-Muslims, took 11 long years before we saw the act come to fruition. And we're committed to a long struggle. We know this is going to take a long time, but we hope that within the context of the changing realities of the 21st century, it will not take as long as the Domestic Violence Act campaign. I mean, we feel that change is inevitable. The public space for debate on Islamic matters in Malaysia has actually opened up. More and more people are speaking up, Muslims, non-Muslims, politicians, civil society groups, are beginning to speak up. And we hope that in 10 years' time, or maybe in 1,001 nights, there will also be, in the way that domestic violence is now, basically universally accepted as a crime in Malaysia, that the same, that there will be universal acceptance in the Muslim community that a man's right to divorce his wife at will, his right to marry 4 wives at the same time, his right to demand obedience, including sexual obedience, and to continue to look at women as inferior and less worthy than men would eventually be unacceptable and disgraceful and a shame for the Muslim community. And for us, this is really not a heresy, but an imperative if religion is to remain relevant to our lives today in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and informative talk. Each of you reminded us of what Rabia was saying about linking thought process to action and implementing the universal values within the local context. Now we have the time, we have a good half hour for questions and answers, and I guess we do have microphones on both sides, so you could use the microphones too. And I would like to begin with a question myself, if I may. Based on what you were saying, and so many questions are going through my mind right now, I just wanted to know, especially Rabia and Zainab, about how the growth of extremism and how the confiscation of religion has affected women's efforts your efforts to improve the status of women in your countries, and what has been your experiences in other countries. And Mahnaz, I also, while you were talking, I was remembering that when you look at the history of the struggles of Muslim women, and I was thinking of Iran, of course, but other countries, Turkey, Lebanon, many other countries, the women in these countries have a history of struggle and, in fact, changing the laws that you were talking about, like, for example, the family protection law in Iran itself. So I wanted you to a little bit go into the historical context of this, and what does that backlash against them mean within the context today? How can we learn from those historical experiences? And then promise you, it's open to your questions. We could start with Zainab and come.
Yeah, of course, the fact that Malaysia, like most other Muslim countries, we are engulfed by the forces of Islamic revivalism, that therefore makes it much more difficult for us to push for reform and to push for rights of Muslim women to be treated as human beings of equal worth and duty, equal worth and dignity. I don't know what's so un-Islamic about that, but of course, very often when we push for, for equal rights, for reform of law, we are accused of being anti-Islam, anti-Sharia, anti-God, the usual, what we really feel are very bankrupt arguments, or other strategies, basically, to defend patriarchy and to perpetuate patriarchy and to use religion to resist change. Again, in terms of law, just specifically in terms of law reform, when we campaigned for the Domestic Violence Act, and my colleague Ivy Josia with the Women's Aid Organization is here, one of the key leaders of that movement. When we were campaigning for the Domestic Violence Act, again, many of the Islamic groups and some of the religious scholars said that this act cannot apply to Muslims. And you have to understand, in Malaysia, 60% of the population are Muslims and 40% are non-Muslims. And so it's ridiculous that, in terms of the government, at least at the policy level, is committed to law reform. And it's ridiculous when law reform takes place within the context of a multi-religious society. The reform benefits those of other faith, but not Muslims, because Muslims are governed by Islamic law that discriminates against women. So again, the Domestic Violence Act, basically they say it can't apply to Muslims because a Muslim man has a right to beat his wife, to discipline his wife, based on a very conservative interpretation of one of the Quranic verses. So again, we had to campaign to make sure that this law applies to Muslims. Whether it's a Chinese man who beats his wife or a Malay Muslim man who beats his wife, it has to be a crime. It cannot be a crime for a Chinese man to beat his wife, but perfectly Islamic for a Malay man to beat his wife. And that's really disgraceful and shameful. And of course, it took us a long time, but eventually we were successful and basically shamed the authorities to apply the act to all citizens. And there were several strategies that we used. In fact, we'll be on a panel, a MESA panel on Monday night to talk about some of the strategies that we used on this. Again, guardianship too. So the Guardianship Act was amended in Malaysia to give mothers equal right to guardianship, but only to non-Muslims. Muslims are excluded from it because guardianship law is under Islamic family law for Muslims. So to change that Islamic family law just takes forever because of the resistance used in the name of religion. So then the way we strategized was actually, because we know law reform will take forever, we then approach it through a policy reform. So we looked at what are the main impact of the Guardianship Act that discriminates against women. So the issue of education, registering your kids to school, application of passports, permission for surgery. So then we strategized and actually got the government to look at the issue as an administrative matter rather than a legal reform matter. So we got the government then to just change all the government documents that say signature of guardian to just read signature of father, mother, or guardian, so that everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims, can sign the documents. Yeah.
C'est une question qui est très intéressante et je pense que nous avons besoin d'en discuter, d'échanger nos expériences. En tout cas pour le Maroc, je dirais que le mouvement des femmes a été assez fort parce qu'il a su réunir autour de lui. Il n'y avait pas que les organisations de femmes, il y avait des organisations de droits de l'homme, beaucoup de partis politiques, beaucoup de syndicats. Et donc, nous avons fait de telle sorte à rendre les discriminations politiquement inacceptables. Personne ne pouvait plus dire oui, les femmes marocaines vivent très bien. Tout le monde disait oui, il y avait un diagnostic, un constat sur lequel tout le monde était d'accord, c'est qu'il y a un problème. Et même les islamistes étaient obligés, parce que c'est des gens politiques, étaient obligés de dire oui, ok, nous sommes d'accord, les femmes marocaines ne vivent pas très bien. Maintenant, quelle est la solution? Comment
Well, I think this is a very interesting question, and it's something that we need to continue discussing and exchanging our experiences. In Morocco, the women's movement was strong because it was able to bring together not only women's associations, but also human rights organizations, political parties, labor unions, to make it such that discrimination became politically unacceptable, and so that it was no longer acceptable to say that Moroccan women are just fine, that everybody came to understand that there was a problem, even the Islamists who could no longer say that things were fine for women, and they all had to agree that there was a problem.
Alors, si nous étions d'accord sur le constat, le diagnostic, comment allons-nous faire pour régler le problème? Alors les islamistes disaient, tout est dans l'islam, il faut juste revenir à une bonne application de l'islam. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, on n'applique pas très bien l'islam.
So once we agreed on the problem, we had to look at how we could resolve the problem, how we could resolve it. And the Islamists, of course, wanted to take an Islamic approach, saying that we needed to come back to a more proper application of Islam because it wasn't being properly implemented.
Mais le problème, je pense, Raja peut aussi apporter quelque chose, je pense que leur faiblesse a été de ne pas avoir, ils ont toujours eu une réaction réactive. Ils étaient toujours obligés de réagir à ce que nous proposions. Ils n'étaient pas proactifs, ce qui fait que nous avons toujours été, disons, on avait de l'avance et eux étaient obligés de réagir. Et ça a été très mauvais. Ils n'anticipaient pas les choses.
And I think one of the problems was that they often had a reactive reaction. In other words, they would be reacting to what we were proposing rather than taking a proactive stance. And that had negative consequences for us because we were moving ahead, but then they were reacting.
Je crois que lorsqu'on a fait la manifestation, je vous ai montré, il y avait des dizaines de milliers de femmes et d'hommes dans la rue pour demander l'égalité. Ils ont fait une manifestation à Casablanca, dans une autre ville marocaine, et beaucoup de gens n'ont pas apprécié. Ils ont dit, si vous dites qu'il faut changer les choses, pourquoi vous avez été faire une contre-manifestation?
And the demonstration that I showed you a picture of earlier brought out tens of thousands of both men and women to protest in favor of changing the law, but there was a counter-demonstration in another city in Morocco, in Casablanca, and people didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that we were demonstrating in favor, but then this led to a counter-demonstration.
Et pour terminer, je dirais que leur réaction nous a été très utile. Quand je dis ça, je peux peut-être choquer, mais je pense que nous avons beaucoup bénéficié de la réaction, parce que ça nous a permis de mobiliser encore plus.
And I would conclude simply by saying that I think that this reaction was actually very useful, beneficial to us. That may seem shocking, but it was something that allowed us to move even further along and gave us more impetus to mobilize.
Just very quickly, because I know people want to comment and question, about the situation in Iran. As you all know, Iran was probably the mother of all Islamist reactions to women's progress, and we ended up with the only theocracy in the world. What we did have 30 years ago was a law which in many ways resembles the reforms that are now in place in Morocco, that is the reduction of polygamy to only very special cases and only once. All the age of marriage, 18, a lot of these things that are now being done, we had already achieved. And I think the backlash to what happened is one of the reasons that we did end up with the theocracy. So the backlash is always something to have in mind. And I think that from our situation, some of our sister organizations have drawn lessons in the sense of trying to involve as many different groups as possible and try to avoid the kind of backlash. Now, of course, times make a difference too. The kind of extremism that we see today wasn't there, some 25, 30 years ago. So this extremism builds into itself the opposition to it, which we now see in Jordan, for instance, and we see it in Malaysia and elsewhere, that people are fed up with that sort of reaction. So there is all this cause and effect kind of thing that women can, on the one hand, watch out for, and on the other hand, make use of some really unreasonable and inhumane practices in order to weaken the opposition and strengthen their own movements. Thank you.
Well, we'll start with the questions, and I would like to ask for both the questions and answers be brief enough so everyone will get a chance. We begin with you and then move there.
This question is for Nasiri. I enjoy your speech very much. It's very provocative. Now, you make the statement that Muslim law is not the same as Islam. And I would like you to expand on the intellectual and especially the theoretical basis for that statement. And the second question follows is, if Islam law as you said, is no longer adequate in solving society's problem, then the question follows, now how do you move from that basis to something new? Do you have an intellectual or theoretical basis for building a new set of laws in place of Sharia, or if you use international established practice or some other theoretical basis? I would like to listen to your answer.
J'ai dit qu'il y a une différence, effectivement. L'islam, c'est le Coran, pour l'essentiel, c'est le Coran, et c'est les hadiths et la vie du prophète, Sira. Le droit musulman, la doctrine, le droit musulman, est quelque chose qui a été écrit, élaboré, et réfléchi, et proposé par des hommes. C'est des hommes qui ont vécu bien après, quelques siècles après le prophète. Donc, c'est des gens qui ont pris le Coran, qui ont pris les paroles telles que transmises par les compagnons du prophète. Et il y a eu beaucoup de différences, beaucoup de gens ne sont pas d'accord sur beaucoup de choses. Et ils sont partis de la vie même du prophète, l'exemple, ce qu'on appelle l'exemple du prophète, pour essayer d'établir comment dire, des lois. Mais c'est des lois qui sont humaines. C'est des lois qui sont humaines. C'est un produit de docteurs, de musulmans, de connaisseurs du droit musulman. Et d'ailleurs, certains d'entre eux disaient, voilà, donc moi je propose ça, et ça reste ouvert, parce que je ne suis pas sûr d'avoir tout fait, tout compris, etc. Hein? Ce droit musulman, il n'est pas le même partout dans le monde musulman. Il y a 4 écoles, vous le savez, 4 rites. Et à l'intérieur des rites, il y a encore des différences. Donc, tout à l'heure, j'ai discuté avec un monsieur qui est dans la salle, qui m'expliquait que chez les Chiites, le droit sur l'héritage, la loi sur l'héritage, est un peu plus égalitaire que chez les Malikiyin. Donc, vous voyez quand même une question aussi importante que l'héritage. Nous allons voir que les docteurs de la foi, les docteurs musulmans, n'ont pas tous été d'accord. Donc, c'est pour ça que je dis que c'est une loi humaine et historique. Elle correspond à un contexte donné, et donc il faut continuer à la travailler, à l'expliquer, etc. Je suis désolée parce qu'il fallait prendre un truc.
Yes, I did say that there's a difference. Islam is essentially the Quran, the Hadith, the life of the Prophet, whereas on the doctrinal level, Muslim law is what has been written, what has been thought about, what has been proposed by men, and men who lived many centuries after the Prophet, that took the Quran and the words and the Prophet's examples as transmitted by those close to him, and tried to form them into law. And there are even differences even amongst these scholars, and they tried to use them as examples to create this law, which is actually a human law, and it's a product of these doctors of religion, doctors of Muslim law. And some have made proposals, but have said, even in those cases, I'm not entirely sure that I have researched everything, that I fully understood everything, so it's open-ended, if you will. The second point is that Muslim law is not the same everywhere throughout the world. As you know, there are 4 schools of thought, and even within the different rites, there are differences. I was talking to a gentleman earlier who was explaining that in one of the schools, the inequalities are even greater than they are between, for example, the Shafi'is and the Malikites. Shiites and the Malikites. So this is a human-based law, it's a historical law, and it corresponds to a given context, and that's what we have to keep working on. We need to keep trying to elaborate on it and to explain it.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, and since the responses to the questions are very related to one another, we'll have people ask the questions and then ask the panel to respond to the questions this way. Did we Mariam.
Okay. I'm Mariam.
Also, please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Mariam Mamar Sadeghi. I work here at Freedom House here in Washington. And thanks, first of all, to all the panelists. We are going to be starting a program that we call Reforming Family Law Program, and it's targeted to the countries of Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait very shortly. And I just wanted to say it here because I know there are people in the audience as well as people in the panel who can be of enormous help to us, and we would welcome it and would be immensely grateful. The inspiration for the project is the Mudawana reform effort, and it's well integrated into the program to take the lessons that you've mentioned here and many more and transfer them, but in a way that's respectful of the indigenous advocacy efforts that are already underway in those three countries. So I would appreciate staying in touch with you. And also, as a question, what do you think is most applicable to those states now, and what do they most need in terms of reforming family law? Thanks.
This question is for Madam Nasiri in particular. I know that one of the aspects of the reform of the Mudawana that was particularly important was incorporating what you might call spokespeople among the ulema who were supportive of the reform. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the strategies were to bring them into that process. Thank you.
Dalal Hassan from the National Endowment for Democracy. I'd just like to get your comments on what is the ideal relationships that you see in terms of support that the Western countries can give for Muslim women reformers, not just financially but also ideologically. There are pros and cons to it, and I'm wondering to what extent did it help you in what you were doing, and just generally speaking, what are the pros and cons? What do you think is the benefit? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sana Saifi. Ms. Nasiri noted that there are different versions of Islam and different interpretations of Islam. And my question is, which interpretation should be used as a framework for this movement? Is there room for progressive movement within Islam? And what does that look like? And my second question was, how much resistance have you seen from women in your initiatives for legal reform in these countries?
Azar Nafisi, National Endowment for Democracy. Rabia, je suis contente de te voir ici. It's really a real pleasure for me to see Rabia today. In memory of the old days when we worked on the manual, on the guide. Since she asked me to just say a few words on the process of writing the guide, I just want to kind of say how this was a learning experience for me at the time. I had just started working with the Association Démocratique des Femmes du Maroc, and at the time, the debate, I mean, what was so unique about the guide is that having a group of women from North Africa work on arguments supporting women's freedom and supporting legal reforms for women was really unheard of. It was the first time that women started looking into a religious argument, not only in North Africa, but also in the Middle East, and maybe we were not aware of similar experiences, maybe in Malaysia or Indonesia, but not in North Africa and the Middle East. And I remember furthermore the look on these honorable scholars' faces when we went to advocate for the reform. And we were using religious argument to support our demands. So it was really a learning experience for all of us, a heated debate on how further we wanted to go, how far we want to go, how to shape our demands and how to introduce them, present them to the population, to the large Moroccan population. And also, sorry, one more thing. The other thing is that also what Rabia said about it was very important to distinguish at the time between the popular perception of what is the Sharia law, which is a human interpretation, and Islam, which is the Quran and the Hadith. So Rabia, thank you very much again, and I've been still working on this since then, and I'm sure a lot of other women are still working on this, so good luck to everybody.
Thank you very much. This would be the number of people who would be asking questions, and we're closing it. And just in the interest of time, please, very short. Thank you.
My name is Hiba Zaino. I work for Feature Story News. My question is probably a bit of a digression, but something happened a few days ago that disturbed me as a woman, and I would like to ask the panel about it, whoever would like to respond. A few days ago, an Iraqi woman confessed on TV that she had tried to detonate herself in a hotel in Jordan, but that her bomb had failed. She said her husband had instructed her to do so and that she had decided to become a suicide bomber to avenge her brothers who had died in Iraq. My question is, do you think we are witnessing a new phenomenon of female suicide bombers? And do you think women who do choose this path, they choose that for themselves, or are they forced into it by men in their family and social community?
Please.
Marlene Khalil from Northeast New Jersey Legal Services, the Family Unit. I'm a family law attorney. First, I'd like to say that you guys are a role model to all young women that are modeling their careers after you. You're also very excellent speakers, and what you said today was very informative and enlightening, so thank you for that. But I'm here to ask a little bit about your suggestions in terms of outreach to the Middle Eastern community in America. We're having a very difficult time reaching out to the Muslim women in New Jersey in terms of all their custody, their domestic violence, and other family law related issues, and I'd like to hear any suggestions that you have on that. Thank you.
My name is Viviana Kristicevic, and I'm an Argentinian lawyer, and my gratitude for the talk. It was really very interesting, fascinating to hear from you. And I wanted to bring a couple of questions based on my experience with the women's rights movement in Latin America, because I think that some of the advocacy strategies that you have chosen are very different from the ones that were used in our region, and some are truly incredibly similar in terms of raising consciousness, working with the judiciary, working with the legislative. And there were two very brief points that I would like to hear your comments on. One is, what can be the role of the judiciary in terms of legal reform? Can judges and judicial operators in your context be able to challenge the legal framework or traditional practices that hinder the rights of women? And the second question is what are the challenges that you see in using human rights law, international standards in advocacy?
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the last question, and short.
A very quick one. My name is Dalia Hassan. I work for the National Council of Childhood and Motherhood in Egypt. My question is about, first of all, I have to say that I am very much in favor of the reform you described, the reform that is happening now in Morocco and in Algeria and Tunisia. But when I talk to men and I try to argue for the reform, and I say that my argument is based on the support of Islam to gender equality. And there are many verses in the Quran that are for gender equality. They respond by saying that there are those verses that are very direct and very clear about the superiority of men in many respects. So how would I be able to refute those arguments?
Thank you so much. These questions show the interest. I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask you, you can go to the WP website, both post more questions and have more answers. And I also would like to ask our panelists, we have 5 minutes exactly, so I'm giving you each, in the corner of a sum up and a message. You have made it so amazing, so people have a lot of questions. You have about 1.5 minutes each of you to respond, and then this will be ongoing.
Yeah, this is an impossible task to answer all the questions. I just want to deal with that last question and another related question about which interpretation to use. You know, this whole process is really about power. You know, like,
the men who say, well, you say there are these egalitarian verses, and the men say, oh yeah, but there are these other verses that talk about, men being superior. Well, there are all kinds of verses that we can use in different ways, but who says, who decides which verse should be the guiding, should provide the guiding principle? And that is really about who has power. And of course, in our society, is the men. So this is not God's law. This is not God's intent. It is those who have power in our society's intent to maintain their domination, and superiority over women. So the important thing in terms of, the related thing about which interpretation to use is the need for us women who believe in justice and equal rights, to claim that right and to create that public space to speak on matters of religion. And this is, for us, this is really, really so important. This can no longer be, a whisper, tiptoe in the right ears kind of approach, and we don't want to wash our dirty linen in public because there's so much prejudice against Islam and all that. This has to be a public struggle, because it's only through public pressure, media support, that the politicians will change, and then the ulama, will change. So it's important that we build that public constituency to support the struggle in order to make it inevitable that change will have to take place. And I'm optimistic that will happen. That we just can't go on in the way that we've gone on over 1,400 years.
Il y a beaucoup de questions. On me dit de répondre 5 minutes, je ne sais pas. Moi, je vais vous dire, d'après mon expérience, il y a certaines choses qui sont importantes. Il me semble, si je prends une expérience de 20 ans pour changer la Bourgogne, il est important que les femmes occupent le terrain religieux et ne les laissent pas aux hommes seulement. Je pense que c'est très important. Même si on sait que l'islam n'a rien à voir dans cette histoire, c'est la politique, c'est le patriarcat, on sait. Mais il ne faut pas laisser le terrain libre, il faut le couper. 2, il ne faut pas, comme on voit aujourd'hui, il ne faut pas que le monde occidental aille changer, réformer les lois dans le... Ça ne marche pas. Ça ne marche pas. Il faut qu'il y ait des organisations sur place. Au Maroc, ce qui a fait la différence, c'est l'existence d'organisations marocaines qui sont implantées, qui sont reconnues. Ils ne pouvaient pas nous dire que nous sommes des traîtres. Ils ne pouvaient pas nous traiter de... Parce qu'ils savent qui nous sommes et que nous sommes des Marocaines et que nous sommes respectables. Donc ça, c'est la deuxième chose. Je pense que si le monde occidental doit donner une aide, un soutien, il doit le faire, mais sans vouloir planter les drapeaux. Il doit le faire dans la discrétion et sans vouloir dire oui, moi j'ai fait ça. Chaque État, chaque organisme doit planter ses drapeaux. Et enfin, je voulais dire qu'il faut profiter des ouvertures démocratiques. Au Maroc, la transition démocratique qui a commencé à partir du début de la décennie 90 a été très utile pour nous. Franchement, les transitions démocratiques, c'est quelque chose de très intéressant et c'est à ce moment-là qu'il faut essayer de pousser le changement.
There were a lot of questions and I was given not much time, so I'll sum up by saying that in my 20 years of experience in trying to change the Mudwana, there are some major important aspects. First of all, that women have to occupy the religious playing field, that they have to be a part of that, even if this really is not a question of Islam, if it's, as we all know, a question of power and patriarchal societies, women still have to occupy a place on the religious field. Secondly, if the Western world cannot come in and reform our laws. That's just not going to, it's not acceptable, it just will not help us. We need to have organizations in the country. That's what made the difference in Morocco. We had Moroccan organizations. So people couldn't say that we were traitors because they knew that we were Moroccan and they knew that we were respectable. If the West is to contribute or to provide assistance, it needs to do so discreetly. They can't come in planting their flag saying, look what we did. And finally, we need to take advantage of democratic openings. That was very helpful for us in the 1990s when there was a democratic opening, democratic transition. We need to take advantage of these opportunities to try to then promote reform. Thank you.
Okay, I think I have about 30 seconds. So I just want to re-emphasize that this conversation will go on our website, www.learningpartnership.org. So please send questions and check. Two quick things. I think the question about within Islam, I think it's very important to be careful about how we use those terms. We all are strengthened and nourished by our religious faiths, whatever they might be, in our case Islam. But within means inside a framework. Inside the given framework that is today, it is not possible to do the work that we need to do. Nourished by, supported by, referred to, fine, within any of the religions, Jewish, Christian, it's impossible to have. The other thing that I wanted to quickly refer to is that Westerners and others from the outside who want to help, important to realize that our deep respect for diversity should not confuse us to think that those people have a certain set of rights because that's who they are. We have a different set of rights for us. Every human being has the same needs, same rights, same aspirations. How we implement them, how we prioritize them are different, and we have to do it within each of our cultures. But let's not compromise on universal rights for every human being. We all have the same human bodies, human souls, human needs. So let's not think that for a Muslim woman having 4 wives around the house or not having a say over your children is maybe okay because they're different, you know. So that's something that is very important to realize. Thank you.
WLP for allowing us to host this wonderful event. And since they did all the organizational work, I would like for Mahnaz to do the thanking. Please stay for thanking of the individuals. This is one of the most important.
Thank you, Azar. I want to, first of all, thank Azar herself and Leila Austin for doing the hosting and the logistics and all the help that they've given and for this wonderful chairing. And the SAIS people, the audiovisual, Valentino and Victor, Amy, Dan and Jeff, wonderful people. My own pals at WLP, Milagros, Anna Workman, Milagros Ruiz, Anna Workman, and Gomezi, and last but not least, Rocky Goyal. They've been wonderful, they always are, and it's great to have them. And I want to also thank Sherry Voss, who's been an old friend of ours and supporter of ours. She has actually translated this text into English from French. And I also want to recognize Dr. Mustafi here, who has edited the text from the religious standpoint, from the Arabic and the French. And you see the international, cross-regional effort that has gone into this. And thank you for the media representatives. You've been so active and so good to us. We need to get the message across. And thank you for my wonderful friends on the panel who are always an inspiration, and for all of you who've spent your very busy hours with us today. Thanks a lot.